everyone, I'm Celine from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to video 2 for the Primula Satchel. We're going to start this video by sewing up our turn lock tab. So you're going to need both of your turn lock tab pieces. I'm using vinyl. You're also going to need your turn lock tab firm interfacing and your turn lock. Now, before we sew the turn lock tab pieces together, you're going to take the turn lock tab pattern piece and place it over one of the vinyl pieces, and then transfer the turn lock tab mark to the right side. Now, it's not going to show well on camera because this is a white pencil, but I always get nervous about the mark showing too much. Just for now, put it like this so you can see it. Okay, and then we can go ahead and sew them together. So the first thing you're going to do is place the two turn lock tab pieces, right sides together. And clip those together. Now, instead of starting at one corner and sewing all the way around and then sewing to the other top corner, I'm actually going to start sewing at the bottom center approximately, and then sew up one side and backstitch. Then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to sew the other half of the turn lock tab. And the only reason why I do this is because personally I always end up having one corner that looks different than the other. Because you're sewing coming from a different direction. I'm not sure why, but they always look different. So I find if I start sewing from the center up on both sides, they look a little bit more symmetrical. Take your time when you're sewing the curves. Okay, I've sewn the turn lock tab pieces together. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance. If you prefer, you can notch the seam allowance. It's up to you. And then turn it right side out. And then I like to use this chopstick because it has a nice soft rounded end, so you don't have to worry about poking through your seam. Okay, and obviously if you're using fabric you can press it, but since I'm using vinyl I can't do that, so I just do as best as I can and just roll the seam. And then you're going to take your turn lock tab firm interfacing and insert that in between the layers. Make sure you get it all the way in to the bottom. Okay, so there should be a gap here at the top where there's no firm interfacing. That's going to be going in your seam allowance. Then I just like to use some clips, kind of flatten that while I'm sewing. So now I'm going to go over to the machine. I'm just going to top stitch all the way around. Make sure that you go really slowly here around the corners so that they look nice and smooth. And if you find it easier, you can actually keep your needle in the down position, then you can just stop and lift your presser foot and just slowly rotate it while you're top stitching. So now that the turn lock tab has been sewn, we're going to install one half of our turn lock. So for this part, you're going to need the front and the back plate of the lock, as well as the screws. They give you 3, but you only need 2. I guess it's just in case you lose one or one of them is not working quite well. So I don't know, you probably can't see it, but I have my mark here. And I'm going to use the back plate of my lock to draw out where I need to punch holes, like this. So that you should be able to see on the camera. Now, for the hole in the middle, I did purchase a set of hole punches. I think they're called leather hole punches, and I got these on Amazon. And there just happens to be one that is the correct shape for that center hole. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to punch out the hole at the center. Make sure that you're using the sharp end on your tab. That looks okay. Okay, so that big hole in the middle is punched out. And then I just use my rotary hole punch. You can also just have one of these that's also with a hammer in a post. And then I just punch out those screw holes. Now, depending on the lock that you're using, obviously these instructions won't apply. This is just for the standard small turn lock that you can actually find on my website. Okay, so you could probably see there's the larger hole in the middle and then the 2 screw holes on either side. Okay, so now we're going to take the front plate. So the front plate has basically, I guess, like a post for the big hole and then the 2 small screw holes. So you insert that way. And then you might have to move things around to get it all fitting properly. And then you place your back plate over top. And then I would suggest putting a drop of glue inside each of the screw holes. I, of course, forgot my glue, so I will take it off and glue it later. You don't use fabric glue for this. You use usually E6000, or you can use Loctite, which is made for this purpose. And then I just screw this in. And I'm not going to bother screwing it in too tightly because I do have to take them out and add glue later. Okay. And now this is what it looks like from the right side. So the next thing I want to do is sew this to the flap, baste it to the flap. So I'm just going to make a mark actually on the wrong side. I'm going to find the center. The dots are starting to erase on my board, which makes it a little bit more difficult. Okay, and then I'm just marking the center here along that top straight edge. Then you're going to need the front of your flap. So that's this piece here, and you'll remember we glued the craft stick sandwich to the wrong side. And then we're going to just use the pattern piece to make a mark at the bottom center. So the fold line at the center is your center mark. Okay, that's this. And then you're going to place the turn lock tab. So you want to see the back plate of so the wrong side of the tab should be facing you, which is the side with the plate with the screws. Your back plate. You want that facing you. Okay, and then I'm just going to go over to the machine and quickly baste this in place. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is sew up our flap handle. You're going to need your flap handle piece. Obviously, if you've decided to not add a flap handle, you can just skip this part. So on the wrong side of my flap handle, I'm going to draw a line on the wrong side all the way through the center, like this. And since we're using vinyl, I can't fold and press, so we're going to go straight to the machine and sew up the handle. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew the short ends together. Just use one clip to hold this. So we're just going to sew this end together, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And you can just use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this step. Now, because I'm using vinyl, I can't press the seam allowance open, so I'm just going to finger press it and top stitch it along both sides. And now what we need to do, again, because we're using vinyl, we have to sew and fold at the same time. So you'll see I have a loop here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold in first 1/2 of the loop towards the center. And keep your needle in the down position while you're doing this. And then I'm going to sew the strap down about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the center here. Okay, so when I've reached the stitching where I started sewing, I overlap the sewing a little bit. And then I go towards where I have the seam here. And that's where I stop and I rotate, fold the other half in, and make sure that that seam is aligned. So I'm sewing along the seam so that the stitching doesn't show. And then I'm continuing folding and sewing the second side of the strap down. So when I get to the end, I just stop and I backstitch a couple of stitches. So now I have this strap loop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten the loop. So the raw edges here, they're going to be hidden inside in the middle. And I place the join seam close to one end, but not quite. Maybe like, I would guess, 1.5 inches from one end. But you can place it wherever you like. I just like it to be where I'm close to where I'm going to attach so it doesn't show underneath here. So I'm just flattening the entire loop and then using clips to hold it in place. Now you don't need to put too many clips because you're going to end up taking them off and moving them around a little bit. So now I'm just going to sew all the way around all 4 sides with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to backstitch a couple of stitches at the beginning and the end. Okay, so this is what our completed flap handle looks like. So now you're going to once again need your the front of your flap, and you're going to need a ruler and a fabric pen. And if you follow the diagram on step 19, we're going to draw a line that is 1¼ inches away from this top straight edge. So 1¼ inches. So this is a fabric pen. It will disappear with heat.
And then you're going to make 2 other marks that are below the original line at each end that are 1 3/8 of an inch from the corner.
So now you probably can't see it, but there is the line here, and then another line here and here. This top line is 1¼ inches away from the top edge, and then the line here and here, 1 3/8, 1 3/8. It's probably easier if you just look at the diagram in the pattern, because this is dark fabric, so my lines aren't showing up very well. So now I like to use some double-sided tape when I do this step. So this is, it's actually leather tape, so it's really, really sticky. You don't want to put this tape where you're going to be sewing. So I'm going to put a piece right here on one end, and then another piece. So my piece is small, just like, I would say 5/8 of an inch maybe. And I put it just inside the stitching along the exterior edges. And it's just to help me keep the handle in place for sewing. So I'm going to put one end within those lines that I drew here, and then the other end here. And now I'm going to sew the handle to the flap with little 7/8 of an inch boxes of stitching at each end. Okay, so our handle is attached. If you wish, you can add some rivets inside your little the squares of stitching here. I like to add rivets, so I am going to add some. Okay, so now we're going to take the other flap piece. This is going to be the underside of my flap. Now, of course, the handle is going to make this part slightly annoying, but I once forgot that I wanted to add a handle and added it to an assembled flap, and that also was not great. So it's just a slightly less pleasant part. Now, if you want, when you're sewing the flap, you can use the same method that I did for the tab to get more even corners, but these are pretty large corners, so I do find it easier to make them look the same on both sides. So I don't worry as much with this step. And an extra one. So we're going to start at one top corner, back stitch, so all the way around, and then when you get to the next top corner, you're going to back stitch again. Just make sure that you go slowly around the corners and try to maintain the same seam allowance. When I get to where the tab is, I do like to sew twice in this area, but I'm going to go all the way around once, and then I'll come back and do a second line of stitching just in this area. So now that we have the two flat pieces sewn together, you can trim your seam allowance, and if you wish, instead of just trimming at the corners, you can go ahead and just notch the seam allowance at these corners. Do not trim the seam allowance where the tab is located. Do not trim this. It's much better to have a significant amount of the tab within the layers of the flap, because if you trim that, the likelihood of you pulling the tab out completely from the seam of the flap is very high. So do not trim this area. And now we can turn the flap right side out. A little bit more challenging because we have our sandwich in there. So because I have fabric at the front of my flap, I technically could press it, but again, I just get a little bit nervous when I've used vinyl because there's nothing worse than getting to this point and then accidentally melting your vinyl. So instead, what I like to do, I'll use my fancy chopstick again, and I just push out those seams, especially around the corners. And then I just go around and I roll the seam in between my fingertips. And that seems to work just as well as pressing. So I do that all the way around. My Peltex is getting in the way there. Okay, now we're going to take the flap from interfacing. And before we stick it inside the layers, you might want to just check to make sure that it still fits. Sometimes you do need to trim. It just depends how good you are with seam allowances. I think it might work. We'll see. If I have too many problems, I take it out and trim it after. And I like to place it so that it is either, so you have your little seam allowance here, either place it all underneath or all over top of that seam allowance. I think I'm going to put it all underneath. And make sure you get it all the way to the bottom. It should be reaching the bottom because when we top stitch in the next step, we want to be including that firm interfacing in the top stitching so that we know it's properly attached in between the layers here. It actually fits perfectly, so no trimming necessary. I love that when that happens. Yes, it's perfect. And then you should be having a gap here that is about 1/2 inch. If you don't have the gap, then you haven't pushed it in for far enough. Okay, and then I'm just going to add a couple of clips. I don't want that firm interfacing moving in the next step when I top stitch. Now for top stitching, I mentioned it in the pattern. You can just top stitch once, top stitch twice. Sometimes it looks nice when you add 2 lines of top stitching, but I go slow if I do that because I like them to be exactly the same distance apart all the way around. Okay, so now we're going to go and do the top stitching. And I think I'm going to try to do 2 lines. Now I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this. And I'm just going to do a quick basting stitch to keep the top edges of the flap together. So the next thing you're going to do is cut out the zipper pocket opening here from your zipper facing piece, which I've already done because, as I mentioned previously, I have made a few bags now with this pattern, so I've already done that step. Now you're going to use this as a guide, and you're going to take your zipper facing piece that you're going to be using for the exterior. So I am using this linen for my exterior, so I'll be using this piece. And then you're going to take the pattern piece and you're going to use it as the guide to draw out this shape. Then you're going to need the main body exterior piece that has the fusible fleece on the wrong side with a cutout that matches this shape here. So you're going to use that piece to install the zipper pocket. Now we want to center these pieces, so just going to mark a center here. Normally I just eyeball this part, but this would be the most accurate way to do it. So mark the center here. And then you can place this right sides together and align those center marks. And your facing piece should come right to the very top. And then you're going to pin the facing piece to that main body piece. And then we're going to sew following this line that we just drew. Make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end, and take your time around the curve so that you sew exactly where the lines are. So now that we've sewn the facing piece, we are going to trim away and leave maybe 1/4 inch in the seam allowance. And then at the corners, we need to have those looking nice, so we're just going to notch into the seam allowance at the corners. So that will make them have a nice round shape when we turn this facing piece towards the wrong side. Okay, just like that. So hopefully you could see what that looks like. So now we're going to flip this facing piece towards the wrong side, like so, and we're going to very carefully and slowly press the seam allowance nice and flat. Whew, that is steamy. So it's better if you roll that seam allowance between your fingers before you press, just to make sure that it's all the way out. Okay, once the back is pressed, flip it over and give it a nice press on the front as well. Okay, now this is ready. We're just going to set it aside temporarily. And now you're going to need your exterior zipper and one of your zipper pocket lining pieces. So I'm going to place the zipper along the top edge of the lining piece and use some clips to hold that in place. So I have my pull opening this direction because in the final bag I would like it to open from this side to that side. So you do the opposite in this step from whichever direction you'd like it to open. So now I'm going to sew all the way across here with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so once your zipper is sewn to the lining piece, you're going to flip it, and you want the seam allowance and the lining pocket to be pressed away from the zipper. So you're going to have your zipper pocket with attached zipper on your work surface. The lining piece should be wrong side facing up, and the zipper is right side facing up. And then you're going to place this over top, and you just want to center it. It's better if you actually look at it this way, probably. So you just want to have that centered. And you want the top edge of the zipper to be lined up with the top edge of the main body. So first I'm just going to clip these sides here. Now that I'm happy with the centering. Okay, get that pull out of the way. And you're going to sew along the curve here of the zipper pocket opening to attach the zipper and the lining piece to this main body piece. Now, when I'm doing this part, I am sewing with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the curved edge here. And what you're going to want to do is maintain the same amount of zipper tape showing between the coil and the edge here of the zipper pocket opening. Okay, so this is now attached, and you're going to need a second zipper pocket lining piece. You're going to place that right side facing up, and then place this over top. It's better if you flip it over. Don't worry if these are not the same length. We're going to trim them. So you basically want to align the edges here, and then make sure that this bottom lining piece comes all the way to the top. And I'm going to just add some clips to hold this in place for flipping it, like this. And then I'm just going to add a couple here at the top. So now we just want to attach that second lining piece to the zipper. You're just going to sew just in between, in the opening here. So back stitch, sew 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when you get to this edge, back stitch again. Okay, so now we're going to flip this around, and you can use pins or clips. You're just going to clip, so we're only clipping the zipper pocket lining pieces together right now. And you can go ahead and trim this so that they are both the same height. You could trim the one lining piece beforehand, but it really makes no difference. Okay, so now we're going to sew the lining pieces together. When I do that, I usually do it this side facing up, and I just pull the main body piece out of the way. And you're going to use approximately a seam allowance of approximately 1¼ inch. You want to start sewing close to here where you've got the stitching from the top stitching here, and go all the way down. And then when you get to the bottom, you want to sew across with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when you get to this other corner, you're again changing to a 1 1/4 inch seam allowance and sewing all the way up here. Now you are not, sorry, you should be including the facing piece in that seam. So I'm going to use a clip to hold that down. You're not including the main body piece in this seam whatsoever. It should not be in the seam. Okay, so the zipper pocket pieces are sewn together, and I'm just going to trim. So you don't want any of this to be within the seam allowance. And you should probably remelt, heat seal the ends of your zipper, the cut ends. Okay, so now you're going to need your top band exterior pieces. You're also going to need your second main body exterior piece. And we're just going to attach the top band to these pieces. So you'll see that the top here is slightly narrower than the bottom. I'm going to move the pull more to the middle. So you're going to flip this so that they are right sides together, and you want to center that top band. I usually just make sure that there's going to be a little corner of the top band sticking out either side. I just make sure that that is an equal amount on both sides, and then clip them together. So this one is going to be a little bit just not trickier, but different to sew on because we have that zipper underneath. So we're going to sew these together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that when you get to the zipper pull that you push it out of the way so that it doesn't get in the way of sewing a straight line all the way across. So same our typical 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Now, a little tip for reducing bulk at these areas when you're doing the final assembly of your bag, uh, go in about 1/2 inch here into the seam allowance and just clip it. Do the same at this side. With sharper scissors if you can. There we go. And then when you're top stitching, normally you top stitch and you have the seam allowance pointing up, but in these areas, instead of having it pointing up, open it at those ends, and then the rest of the way you can have it facing up. And then the same thing at this end, when you get to top stitch this end, open up the seam allowance, and this one here should be facing up while you're top stitching. So that's what it would look like from the back. I'll So now I've got the top band attached to this main body piece, and you're just going to repeat exactly the same thing to attach the second top band piece to the second main body exterior piece. So I think this will make it easier to picture. So you've clipped into the seam allowance here, and then when you're top stitching at the ends here, about 1/2 inch, you're opening the seam allowance, but then along the rest of the top stitching, you have the seam allowance pointing up towards the top of the bag, and then it just ends up looking fine on the front, on the right side. Now, before we can attach these two exterior panels to the gusset, we need to mark some centers. So I'm just using the fold line at the bottom of the main body pattern piece to mark the center at the bottom on the wrong side. And then for this piece here that has the zipper pocket, I'm also going to mark the center here because that'll help me center my flap a little bit later on. And you're going to start by lining up the center seam of the gusset with that bottom center mark. And then I do the corners at the top. And then I'm going to start putting clips with the section in between. And I find it easier if I do it this way. You're going to notice that the gusset is a tight fit, and I do that on purpose because the way that you get puckers when you're sewing pieces to a gusset is if your gusset is too long. However, if the gusset is a tight fit, you can make it work because you're going to be clipping into the seam allowance, which I'm going to show you when I am sewing these together. I'm going to keep this zipper pocket out of the way. So you see how it kind of has like a little pucker here? That's because the gusset is slightly smaller. And I know sometimes this confuses people, but I promise you it will work. So then I'm going to go ahead and clip the rest on this side. Then again, you should be seeing some puckers here at the corner. Okay, and now we're going to go over to the machine and sew these together, starting at one corner, backstitching, working all the way around, and then backstitching again at the top corner. We're going to go over to the machine and I'm going to show you. Have a pair of sharp scissors handy because we're going to be clipping into the seam allowance as I'm about to show you. Now when we're sewing this part, you're going to want to sew with the main body on the bed of your machine. So your gusset should be right side facing up. So remember we had those puckers here at the corner. Here's where your scissors are going to come in handy. So when you get to the curve, you're making little 1/4 inch snips into your gusset. Not the main body, only the gusset. And then you're going to see that it's going to work. It's going to sit flat and you're going to be able to sew it on. Now I'm also kind of pushing the gusset in so that it follows the edge of the curve here. Now we're going to do the same thing here. You see how the gusset is kind of flipping up? Do those little notches. And then you can get it to sit flat. Now if you like, you can sew this seam twice, just very slightly spaced apart, just to make sure you have an extra strong seam here on the exterior of your bag. Now just to show you here in the corners, no puckers in your gusset at all. Nice smooth seam.
Now before we can attach the second main body piece, we need to install the second half of our turn lock.
So you're going to need your pattern piece, and it should have this mark on it. You can punch it out using a hole punch or whatever you like. And you're going to place this over the main body piece and then just make a mark at that spot. Okay, right here. And you're going to need freight check and a seam ripper and the other half of your lock. So the other half of your lock should have the back plate. Put that away. And then this part here, like that. So these are the two pieces that you need. So you're going to start by placing I wish I had a pencil. Let me get a pencil. Okay, so you're going to place the back plate over top so there's a center hole here in the plate. You're going to put that over the mark that you just made. And then I know for my prongs here that they are the middle lines here. So I'm going to just make a mark in this middle one. So there's three holes on either side of the center hole, and it's the middle one that I know works for these prongs. So that's what that looks like there. So now we got to cut out, just make a little cut on those lines. So when I'm doing this with the seam ripper, I'm not just poking it in and then ripping. I put I put the pointy end of the seam ripper at the top of the line, and then right away I bring it up to come through the bottom of the line, and then I know that I'm just ripping that small portion. And then I'm going to do the same for this side. Okay, just like that. And then a drop of fray check on each cut. Especially, this is not really necessary if you're using cork or vinyl or something similar, but I'm using a fabric that frays, so you definitely want to use your fray check. Then you insert the prongs of your lock through the fabric. Flip it over. Now, before I put my washer, I like to be super cautious, and I'm going to get a scrap of Peltex and put that over the prongs first. I'm just trying to mark where I need to cut holes into my Peltex for the prongs. Put the prongs through there. And then I can put on my washer. And then I find these prongs so hard to fold in, so I use this part of my rotary cutter to do it for me. Better the handle than my fingers. And then you have to put a piece of tape or something over the prongs so that they don't scratch your lining. Normally I would put something a bit stronger like duct tape, but this is all I have right now. Okay, so now this is ready, and then we can attach this to the other side of the gusset, same way as we did this one. Follow exactly the same steps. Okay, so now that both panels are attached to the gusset, I'm going to trim seam allowances. Okay, so I'm going to do things in a bit of a different order here, and I'm going to sew up my my strap connectors first, and then I'm going to turn the bag and attach my flap. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I have a flatbed machine. I don't have a free arm. I find it easier to attach the connectors when the bag is wrong side facing out. Just personal preference. So the first thing you're going to do is on the wrong side of your strap connectors, you're going to draw a line down the center on the wrong side. So they are 3 inches wide, so your line should be 1.5 inches from each edge. And again, I'm using vinyl, so I can't press. We're going to go over to the machine, fold in towards the center, and then sew them down. So I'm folding in wrong sides together towards the center, and then I'm going to sew this down with 1/4 inch seam allowance from the center line. When I get to the bottom edge, I just stop, rotate, and then fold over the second half, so across, and then sew the other half down. Then you're going to take one of your 1.5-inch rectangle rings and pass the strap piece through the ring. Fold it in half so the raw edges are together. Do a quick basting stitch here along the bottom edges. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew up one side of the connector, sewing the two halves together, and then stop beneath the ring just with enough space so that you can easily turn around and keep sewing. You're going to sew across the strap piece and then stop and rotate and go back down towards the bottom raw edges. And you're doing that with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edges. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the second rectangle ring and the second connector strap. So both connector straps are finished, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew one to each top edge of the gusset. Now they're pretty much the same width as the gusset, which makes it really easy to center them. And I like to leave about 1/2 inch of the connector sticking up past the top edge. And these aren't really going to accomplish anything, but I'm going to leave them there so that they kind of stop it from moving. And then I'm going to just go in and baste these in place. Okay, so that's what that looks like when it's basted. And I'm going to do the same thing for the second strap piece on this side. Okay, so these are basted on. Now we're going to turn the bag right side out. And the last thing we're going to do in this video is baste our flap to the back of the bag. I'm not going to bother pressing or anything right now because I'm going to be turning the bag in a future step, so there's really no point trying to press these just yet. So this is the front of our bag, this is the back of our bag, and we want the flap to be on the back. Now you'll remember I put a center mark here. I'm just going to do the same for my flap. So the flap is just to say over 9 inches wide. So I made the center mark approximately 4.5 inches from either side. And when you're placing it on the bag, you want to have the flap facing the bag. So you want the wrong side of the flap facing up. And once again, your handle is going to be in the way. There's no way around it. So we're just going to use some clips to hold it in place, and then we're going to go and baste this to the bag. Okay, the flap is now basted. You can turn around, try to close your bag. It is going to feel a little bit tighter because we still have extra seam allowance at the top, but this is what we've got so far. So in the next video, we're going to work on the lining assembly and the final assembly of the bag.